Szanowni Państwo, Ekscelencje, abonenci, przyjaciele. Welcome to the Warsaw European Conversation. These are serious times, and such times demand serious measures. At today's Warsaw European Conversation, we will not solve the problems of the world. What we want to do is to find the right people to ask the right questions, to examine the possible answers, to think of the actions that need to be taken in order to start moving in the right direction. We need to have a serious conversation about Europe. We need it now, and we need it here. This was how we started the Warsaw European Conversation. Today, we bring you 4 podcasts in which, with our moderators, speakers, and friends, we examine the topics discussed during our annual conference. Hanna Cichy spoke with Matthew Kaminski, editor-at-large at Politico, and Christian Schulz, deputy chief European economist at Citi, about the trade war, its consequences, and Europe's competitiveness.
My guest is Matt Kaminski, editor-at-large at Politico and co-founder of Politico Europe. Hi, Matt. It's great to have you here today.
Great to be here.
At the beginning of the year, you wrote an article, Trump's World of Peril and Opportunity. After this approximately 10 weeks, do you see more peril or more opportunity?
I think if you were to put a worst-case scenario for people who had some optimism about Trump coming into office, and the optimism was not entirely naive because it was based on how Trump behaved in his first term and the feeling that there were people around Trump. There was always a battle within the Republican Party around more traditional Republicans. I would call them Reagan Republicans, people who thought that America should be a more leading power in the world, was under-leveraging its great strengths domestically, should be really backing Ukraine stronger, backing Europe stronger, more active in Asia. People like Mike Pompeo who were sort of voicing these views. I think the warning signs came out, first of all, that the other side of this Trump coalition, the more MAGA, the more isolationist, in his choices of cabinet members, he started picking people who kind of raised multiple eyebrows. Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth for the Pentagon. And so the way it's played out in the first 54 days or whatever we are in now in the Trump era, it is really the extreme version of, let's say, the conventional Republicans' worst-case scenario, that you're getting none of the positives that you were hoping for Trump, which is global leadership, get some lower taxes, let's lower regulations to get the animal spirits going. And on the world stage, let's show American peace through strengths. And people hear peace through strength, I think of Ronald Reagan, think of America as leading along with allies. In fact, the opposite has happened both economically and strategically. We can talk about why, but this stage in, we are at an extreme. I will just say one last thing. There's a great Herb Stein line. If things cannot continue, they will stop. A lot of this does not seem sustainable longer term, either domestically or internationally. But we are much more in perilous times than we are seizing opportunities.
I would like us to concentrate more on the economic side of this. In your opinion, what is the real or the major reason for the trade war that Trump is waging on the war? Is it to increase budget revenue or to protect internal markets or to project power in international relations? Because in the medium run, those are contradictory, right?
I wish we could have a sophisticated, rational conversation about why Trump is doing what he is doing, but we can't. Because I think what this really comes down to is that Trump likes tariffs. He said it. Listen to the guy on stage. Tariff is one of the best words in the English language. And the people around Trump are either reinforcing this view, someone like Peter Navarro, who's his trade advisor, who used to be a lobbyist for the U.S. steel industry, is saying, yes, your instincts are right. We got to close down the borders and this is going to bring back American manufacturing. And by the way, you were out on the campaign for months promising, blue collar workers, you're going to help them. And this is the way you help them. I think it's instinctive to Trump that he thinks this is good, that you basically, it's a zero-sum world and you're going to bash weaker countries, and ultimately Canada and Mexico are a lot smaller economically than you are. Same with Europe. Europe's divided. This is a means of doing two things. One, beating up people who are weaker than you are to get concessions that are good for you. And I do think there is something deeper here that, by the way, goes against almost 100 years of both economic and political consensus experience, that Trump thinks that this is the way you're going to remake the American economy, to bring back kind of 1950s, manufacturing base and good blue-collar workers, old middle-class jobs. And he just believes this. And here, we'll see how fast this belief hits the reality of tariffs are bad for inflation. They are bad for the economy. The S&P 500 is in correction territory, which means that the economic signals are all red.
To get to this point, if this is the point that Donald Trump and his administration is aiming at, to get to this industry-based economy and heaven for blue-collar workers, you need some kind of consistency. You put these tariffs, you block the imports from Canada, from Mexico, from Europe, from whatever, and you keep it there for a prolonged period of time to get this investment going, to maybe complement with some other industrial policy to attract these investors. But so far, the only consistency we've seen is in trade relations with China. In all other areas, it's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, and maybe 1 sidestep for some other reason.
All within 24 hours. The key word there is consistency, and that's the one adjective you would never use to describe Donald Trump. Which again, that could lead you to be a little bit hopeful that Trump can change his mind very, very quickly. And people who support him expect him to change his mind, that he is gut politician. He does this thing here, he changes his mind, goes over there. I think what we're seeing in Trump too is the person we saw in the first Trump administration without the checks that you had on Trump then. He had a better set of advisors. I think he was more humble, which is not a word you'd often use to Trump, but I think he didn't expect to win the election. There's a hubris to what he is doing now, and he feels that he can be himself, which is exactly what you're seeing. I'm going to impose, the Europeans really make me very angry. I'm going to put 200% tariffs on French champagne and wine. The puzzling thing, and again, I live in Washington. I spend a lot of time talking to people in Washington. I can tell you the people who are closer to this have no better insight or necessarily understanding of what's going on or what may happen than you do out here. I think people are perplexed. Usually the old Trump would see the market go down 10%. He really used to care a lot about the stock market and would think, this is bad. I don't want to. For now, he is saying, no, this is part of the transitional cost of becoming a more manufacturing-driven economy, and my voters are going to put up with it. I think what people are hoping for is that those old checks will start to work. He's got a pretty good Secretary of Treasury who seems so far fairly weak, at least in his public statements, but he's had a good reputation coming in. If he does listen or used to listen to CEOs and top business people who told him things aren't going that great, this is not working for the U.S. And ultimately, if Trump realizes it's not working for him, you would think a rational brain would say, no, let's reverse course. But we are dealing with a rogue president in this moment. It doesn't mean that in 2 months or in 5 months, this will not settle out as the rational mind would think that it should.
But there's no way of knowing.
That's why everyone's so...
You mentioned the stock market, and it seems that in his first term, Trump watched very closely on the markets and used the
bragging about it.
Yes. It was his benchmark for his policy, right? Now the stock market is bleeding, and also business reactions to all these trade policies mixed, to say at least. The steel makers are happy, but the car makers are not. The Trump and his court determined to pursue this agenda no matter of what? Or will you think at some point the private sector gained their ear and spoke some reason?
The policy betrays a complete lack of understanding of even how manufacturing works today in the U.S. I was just in Chicago 5 days ago talking to people in manufacturing there. Like, these companies have over the last 20 years, if not longer, built up incredibly sophisticated supply chains to build. An iPhone goes through 18 countries on average. There are companies in Minnesota, in Illinois, where parts go back and forth over the Canadian border multiple times before they end up in something. There is no more the old industrial economy that died 60, 80 years ago, and tariffs are not going to bring it back. They did not bring back the agricultural economy in the 1920s when the U.S. suicidally embraced protectionism. My generation grew up talking about the Smoot-Hawley Act, which was 1930 tariffs that basically led to the Great Depression and helped bring about World War II. There was a consensus across the board for 80 years that this was stupid. It is still stupid. And for some reason, we have a president who believes it is not stupid. I think that at least domestically, you are seeing the mood change. And I think you're seeing the mood change inside the White House as well, where he came in, I had this glorious victory, I survived an assassin's bullet, I know what I'm doing, I'm the biggest political star of the 21st century. I think that confidence doesn't seem as set as it used to be because, again, as you were saying, the stock market is down 10%. People are talking about a recession where 2 months ago we were talking about the world's strongest economy by far, the fastest growing, is sort of, just hit a wall. Confidence, consumer confidence, sort of confidence among CEOs, those are steeply down as well. I don't see how in a system as finely tuned the way the U.S. system is, where there are multiple checks on power. It's not just the courts and the Congress, but business elites, popular opinion, that some of this has to ultimately slow this down. But again, you're dealing with a president who's 78 years old, who feels has a divine right to rule in some sense, and in theory is not running for office again, so he wants to get a lot done quickly.
And this change of mood that you mentioned, it is or it will be diversified in terms of geography, right? Because these tariffs, this trade policy does not affect the whole country equally. If you were to put high tariffs on the Mexican border, it affects some companies, some states more than the others. And maybe this can change the political dynamics within the states and going from the bottom up.
It affects people equally in the sense that suddenly you're paying more for imported goods. And if there are 13 million manufacturing workers, but there are 300 million Americans who suddenly are going to be paying more for things that they're used to paying less for, then that will be felt across the board. But even in terms of manufacturing, a lot of the manufacturing states are actually red states, sort of pro-Trump states. This is not good for manufacturing because suddenly, the cost of your inputs goes up a lot, especially in a global economy that is as interconnected as it has been until now. So if suddenly we're talking about decoupling the U.S. and the global economy, yeah, you can maybe get there one day, but the cost will be severe. And the danger is that you end up like Argentina 100 years ago, cut off from the world. But the cost will be so severe. You're talking about potentially impoverishing a lot of country. Now, it doesn't mean that tariffs, if they're more surgically used, can't be used short term. It doesn't mean that tariffs can't be used to get, more favorable trade treatment, but it has to be reciprocal. What is, again, insane, stupid, whatever you want to use the word absurd about the Trump approach is that he's not asking for a better trade deal. He's just throwing numbers out there. And people hear about, well, he likes the number 25 because it's round and big and 15 would be too small. 200% on French wine, big number. And the danger is, one, that hurts you domestically, but then you're dealing with pretty sophisticated people here in Europe. Europe has gotten used to being down on itself for the last several decades. Not Poland. Poland has got a lot of self-confidence for good reasons, but Europe does have down. But suddenly people realize, wait a minute, we are rich. We have a big economy, all of Europe together, if you throw in Norway and Sweden and sort of Switzerland, that comes close to the size of the U.S. economy. And they're not going to be pushed around like this. So I think that Trump has overplayed his hand and has whittled away. Trade policy is true in Russia and Ukraine, it's true in other places, has whittled away the advantages he had only a couple weeks ago. And it seems suicidal to me and stupid.
You say stupid again and again. I have this colleague who keeps insisting on, maybe because you don't agree on something, it doesn't mean it has no merit. Maybe these people know what they're doing, they've been preparing to it, maybe there is some merit to it. And the White House has just recently published the list of new investments from Stellantis, Honda, from Taiwanese chip makers.
I think the policy is stupid. I'm not saying Trump is stupid. I think Trump cannot be underestimated as, certainly not as a politician, as we saw in the last 6 months, but even as a president. And if you go back to the first term, he had a fairly successful presidency, except for the last year or so. And he really screwed it up with his response to COVID, where his worst instincts took over. And he wasn't, I always thought there's a pragmatic streak to Trump. And what I think confuses people and really discombobulates them is the noise that he is like no one else you have ever seen before, especially in the White House. But if you go back to what he's trying to accomplish, I assume it's not to impoverish the U.S. economy so you get some factories back in Ohio, but it is to see, if you take it literally, make America great. Okay, how do you do that? You do it by making it richer. How do you do that? By making sure that business is confident, consumers are confident. And I think Trump is certainly the kind of politician who is willing to say, okay, I got what I needed, look at these wins, and now we got to deal with the Europeans, got to deal with Canada and Mexico. There's fentanyl, nothing was coming across the border, it isn't coming at all, and we're back to doing business together. The danger is that he has so rattled the world that no one is going to trust him the way they might have even a few weeks ago to stick to any of these agreements. And that is the change. I think, and those guys, I'm not sure the White House understands this and doesn't understand the reaction and even maybe the overreaction in Europe, in Canada, in Mexico, because they ultimately are listening. And this is true of every president who's come in the office, at least the last 4. They care about their core constituency more than they care about the American middle, even though the American middle is much bigger than the core constituency. So Trump is not losing support among the 35% of hardcore MAGA people. They're going to cheer him on no matter what. And yeah, this is what he promised. I'm going to put tariffs on. I'm going to push people around who are weaker than us because that's the way you make America bigger. But he is doing damage to the U.S. economy longer term, and I think he is being told that by people that he used to listen to. Now, whether he listens to them, we'll see. I guess the only thing this is both a terrifying thought and the reassuring thought is that we're only 50-some days in, and there's still almost 4 years to go.
But there's less than 2 years to the next midterms, and maybe this will change.
Could change things. Presidencies. It is also remarkable how fast Trump has lost support in the U.S. At this point, Biden was at around 65% approval ratings in the U.S. and had pushed through, a huge bailout and was teeing up some big legislation. Trump is wasting his honeymoon. Is he doing it because he actually wants to set up an authoritarian state in America and is willing way of the rule of law? A lot of things are happening that are very concerning, but ultimately, if you still believe that Trump can be checked by reality, the reality is not a very good one for him right now. It's not a horrible one because he can claim I'm stopping people at the border.
And the jobs are up.
Well, jobs are kind of, the job report was okay. But again, if we're talking about recession, that is a huge change from January. A session with some CEOs in January in Washington, next 2 years are going to be amazing, but then we may get a hangover if these stupid trade policies are implemented. Instead, the hangover is happening right now, which no one thought would happen,
We're talking a lot about trade because this is what is seen in Europe. And the other thing that we see in Europe is all this Dodge show, which is exciting this way that people look at the car accident because it's hard to stop looking at it in this cringy way. But maybe there is more to it. Maybe there is something that you see in Washington that we do not see in Europe. Maybe there is, in terms of economic policy, is there anything else happen? Like there was supposed to be tax cuts or maybe some deregulation in a real meaning of this word, not we're cutting half of civil servants, but some real regulation or some reindustrialization policies. Is there anything else to look at?
I think you had broad consensus. This is partly why he won. That, look, what is definitely true within Europe, by the way, that the U.S. government is getting fatter, not thinner. At some point, as you get obese, you become unhealthy. There was a moment where the US started to pay more in interest on its debt than it was spending on the military. That's usually one of the kind of leading indicators of decline. So the general point is that something needs to be done to put our state either on a diet or to find a way to it gets taller and bigger, and therefore your sort of fat count goes down. So you can kind of get out of the deficit problem either by growing the GDP. But the U.S. has a share of the debt as a share of GDP is way out of EU rules. It's almost double what you're allowed under the Maastricht Treaty. So it's like 6+%.
Well, some are European states as well. So
no, yeah, but at least they're supposed to be thinner by the Maastricht rules, so they're not. So the idea that you should deregulate, I don't know a single CEO who would be like, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but is this really a deregulation what is happening?
No, but this is the other side of this. But suddenly getting a kind of cultural revolution style scenes in the US, we have 21-year-olds, no doubt brilliant because Elon Musk found them at, some university, or there were some like child geniuses who are there kind of yelling at bureaucrats or throwing them out of their offices and firing them, and without seemingly any larger plan. So you have someone like Musk, who, incredible businessman, an incredible visionary, comes in and just says, I'm going to do to the U.S. government what I did to Twitter, which is fire people randomly, close offices. I'll make some mistakes, but, as Stalin said, to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. You are dealing with, first of all, human beings in a democracy, in a government, where actually some of the government functions are super important. The Cultural Revolution thing, that didn't end very well for China. Revolutions don't tend to end, especially if they're driven by rabid youth, where destruction is the end goal. And there was no reason to do it. Well, I think they would say, no, there's no other way because this is the way that technology has shaken up the world, and we're going to do the same thing to the government. Instead of the Revolutionary Guards in China, you get these Silicon Valley, kind of, there's a phrase now called techno-bro-fascists, people who kind of apply thinking that you do to a startup or to a engineering problem to a government of millions of people, and without adult supervision. And it's not clear what the end result is. And by the way, they're not going after the main source of the US deficit, entitlements. Shutting off an AIDS prevention program in Africa, and you're saving pennies. You're destroying the U.S. government-supported media outlets that fight, the Chinese-run, Iranian-run, Russian-run media outlets across the world. China's spending a lot of money on soft power. It's spending a lot of money on media. It's spending a lot of money on foreign aid.
Every American vaccine that does not reach Africa is replaced by a Chinese vaccine probably right now.
And probably an inferior one, but then you've lost support. And we're fighting China ultimately for global supremacy. So why retrench, and why do it in such a thoughtless way? It is actually they're open about it being thoughtless. They're saying creative destruction, that is the way. But this is not a company startup. And by the way, most tech startups fail.
And that's what startups do, right?
Yeah. And instead you have what's supposed to be, what has been for 80 years, incredibly responsible, quite generous superpower whose power came from the friendships and alliances that it had, not from because it happened to be the strongest and could coerce people to behave a certain way. There's not an understanding of that. And the rudeness, like the brutality of the rhetoric, from J.D. Vance, and they're just, again, it's like a techno bro. It's like Party MAGA, this fake wrestling league they all love. But it's also the techno bro culture in Silicon Valley and California. And the end result is the ugliest American that you can imagine, which this is part of politics, but I think ultimately it is undermining U.S. interests. And there is starting to be pushback against this. But the opposition does not organize right now, either internally to the party or on the other side.
For all of our sakes, let us hope that what you said earlier, when things cannot continue, they have to stop.
I mean, the question now is whether you have already changed so much that actually fundamental things have been changed. Today I heard that the Portuguese canceled their F-35 program, meaning that the Europeans don't believe and will never trust the US again.
Yeah, trust is a hard thing to rebuild and easy to lose. So. Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.
My guest is Christian Schulz, the Deputy Chief European Economist at Citi.
Hello.
Morning, Christian. Glad to have you here. The situation is really erratic at the moment around the global trade, and I think that's a major concern that anyone have right now. Maybe start with the most pressing issue. What, in your opinion, should be the EU response to US tariffs? Shall we negotiate? Shall we compromise? Shall we escalate?
I think not responding is not really an option. There will have to be some retaliation. I think what is important about the retaliation is that we minimize the economic damage to ourselves and maximize the political damage that we do in the US. Clearly, the tariff wars are going to have negative implications for the US economy anyway, and will probably at one point or another cause political tensions on the other side of the Atlantic. That creates an opportunity for Europe to maximize the leverage of its actions by targeting them to the right constituencies in the US. And I think what I've seen in terms of announcements focusing on certain constituencies such as whiskey in Kentucky and motorbikes and Florida oranges and so on does exactly that. It's meaningful retaliation, but it will have very limited effects on the European economy.
On the other side of the pond, it will be multiplied by more or less similar tariffs from Canada, for example, because Canada is also targeting the liquor, for example.
The tariffs are only part of the economic response. It's also consumer behavior. And you can see in Canada that people are buying Canadian. And I think you can see also, at least with individual products, also already in Europe, consumer response to America's behavior, especially when you think about electrical cars. Car registration numbers for one particular car maker, American car maker, have dropped. While that may have all sorts of fundamental reasons, I think a big reason is also this car maker in particular is seen as representative of the current US government.
An icon.
An icon, exactly, of the new administration, but an icon that makes itself vulnerable to this kind of consumer response.
But on the other hand, there are certain limits to which we can decouple from the American, to which we can decouple very fast. So you cannot buy American electric cars or maybe deter your decision about buying an electrical car at all. But we're very, very dependent in Europe on American resources, on American gas, on American weapons, and on American tech. Do you think that in the long run, if the current US administration continues this erratic behavior around the trade, to threatening tariffs, delaying them, threatening again, will Europe be on a path to decouple in tech, for example?
There is a lot of excitement, I think, about specifically that. Yes, in the short run, there are clearly a lot of negatives from the current situation. We discussed the tariffs, which even if Europe retaliates, the American leverage is much higher, or the economic damage is going to be greater here than, at least in the short run, than it is in the US. Very importantly, for us, it's a demand shock, right? We can export less to the US. And because of that demand shock, we'll see lower growth here in Europe, lower employment, and ultimately lower inflation. Whereas for the US, it's a supply shock. It's going to push up prices and therefore lower growth. Both will end up with lower growth, but the Americans will end up with higher prices. We will end up with lower prices. And this also goes for defense and all the other areas where the Americans are using the leverage they have at the moment in order to get Europe to do certain things. In the short run, they create negatives, mostly via the uncertainty channel. It's no longer clear that Europe can depend on America's security guarantees. And in the current context of what's going on our eastern borders, that creates uncertainty. And this uncertainty is going to weigh on investment. All sorts of investment decisions will be delayed at the moment because of the uncertainty about relations with the US and security more generally. And that's why public investment in these circumstances is so important, right? If the private sector is uncertain, it creates a bigger role for the public sector. Now, the problem with the public sector investing is it isn't going to be immediate, right? It cannot offset the uncertainty right now. It will, over time, help the economy generally. But for the time being, we've got the uncertainty effect weighing on the economy. And on top of that, because of the announcement about public investment, we've got higher interest rates, right? Obviously, markets are already pricing that in the future, there will be a bigger supply of government bonds to fund public investment. And that's already pushing interest rates higher. And again, weighing on the economy. Mortgage rates are rising at the moment. So short-term pain, But long-term gain, and what that gain is going to be, depends very much on what you just said. The questions that we're asking ourselves at the moment: in what areas do we have to reduce dependence on the US? Defense, clearly, because the Americans want us to, but we probably have to go beyond, probably have to behave a little bit like the Chinese did 10, 15 years ago when they started reducing their dependence on the West in all sorts of areas. That's suboptimal from a global perspective, but from a European perspective, it is an exciting prospect, right? We've seen this in the past. In the 70s, we started making our own airplanes, what has become Airbus. During the pandemic, we're making vaccines that we thought were impossible to make in Europe in record speed. So when Europe really comes together to do these things, often, not always, but often you do actually get at least good second best, maybe not first best, but second best. So there's a lot of excitement, I think, about this, but I would warn that there's also risks.
I would like us to dwell a bit on this risk because you called it exciting, and for some companies, maybe for some sectors, it definitely is. But on the other hand, aren't we just getting on the same protectionist bus that the US is on? There is a reason why the global economy has these very long, very widespread value chains. And the reason is not because someone, some authority or some bureaucrat decided that it will be good, but because it works, because it gets you more goods, cheaper goods, diversified goods. It gets you more competition, more innovation. It's better for the customers in the long run. So when we suddenly wake up ourselves in a situation that after the pandemic and now after the trade war, we decide to build everything in Europe, which is impossible, end up not only with less goods and more expensive goods, but also in the long run with less competition, and it will be harmful for our customers.
We're moving away from a world of competitive advantages, right? Where there's always a gain to be had from trading with one another, the Ricardian world. We're unfortunately moving away from that. We're moving back to a world of absolute competitive advantages where we're basically saying, we need to be better in all areas than our rivals. We need to make everything ourselves because we can't rely on them as we've done in the past. And that is going to be less efficient. But unfortunately, the reason why this is happening is that in order to have this world of competitive advantages and this maximum exploitation of global trade, you need a rules-based global trade order. And this was a very cumbersome and long process, the WTO, creation of WTO and the various free trade agreements around that, something which Europe in particular played a very important role in because Europe's own integration kind of served as an example always for everybody else, right? People call it a regulatory superpower. If 27, 28 countries could agree on something, then probably the rest of the world could fall in line as well. But that's no longer where we're going, right? We're reversing this. Important, powerful countries are just not playing by these rules anymore. And that is very dangerous to Europe. And that's why I was saying there's risks to all this excitement. At the moment, we're kind of assuming that Europe will come together over this. And yes, we're moving away from this globally integrated economy, but at least we're left with regionally integrated economies. We've got some American bloc, some Chinese bloc, and then a European bloc. I think the big risk here is that we're overestimating or underestimating Europe's ability to go to war with itself, and that we're a little bit overly optimistic about Europe coming together and working together to replace American technology, to replace Russian gas, and to replace Chinese manufacturing prowess and do everything ourselves. There's a big risk there will be also tensions within Europe and that countries will go it alone. If even in Europe we no longer have this trade-based, rules-based trading system, then I think the damage to Europe will be even greater than to the other economies in the world.
Before I ask you more about these global trade rules, because that's something that we'll be discussing on the panel today later, one more thing. Maybe the politicians should start to prepare their constituencies for the costs of this kind of policy. We had this back in the COVID times. Politicians decided that what is really needed now is a big fiscal and monetary stimulus. And we had it, and it was necessary. But we knew back then there will be costs to it, and the cost will be higher inflation. But because no one talked about this cost openly, then when the inflation came, there was a lot of regret, of misunderstanding, and as a result, lots of government changes across Europe because opposition parties gained power on this misunderstanding. And now we're heading on the same path. This or that prime minister or EU official comes to the stand and they say, we will have new jobs, exciting new technologies being built, we'll build ourselves this or that, and it will create more growth, more jobs. And this person is never telling, but it will cost you. And in a few years' time, we'll wake again with people being shocked by that we cannot no longer buy all these nice, cheap goods that we enjoyed.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you knew inflation was coming. I think most didn't expect inflation to come after the pandemic. Certainly I didn't. And the reason was that the economy collapsed, of course, during the pandemic. Our fear, certainly, or many people feared that this would lead to very high unemployment rates for a very long time, and that the stimulus or the fact that government paid effectively higher unemployment benefits for some time would just be a drop in the ocean, and the bigger risk would still be deflation rather than inflation. But in retrospect, of course, you're right. I mean, at least I have to accept that we were wrong. At the time, inflation did come, although I wonder how high inflation would have been in Europe had there not been the extra shock of Russia cutting off our gas supplies. I think that was really what triggered the very high inflation rates that we saw temporarily. But even there, you could say, many governments in Europe guaranteed low energy prices for consumers and companies for a long time, running high deficits in order to do that, which also in the long run probably prolonged this inflationary process. Had they not done this, we would have probably destroyed our industry altogether, but we probably would have ended up with less inflation. The point I'm trying to make is there are inevitable economic costs if you shut down large parts of the economy. There are inevitable economic costs if your biggest gas supplier shuts down supply. It's a question of how do you distribute these costs. Had we not created these furlough programs during the pandemic, the costs of lockdowns, of protecting everybody against COVID would have been borne by people working in the...
Okay, but I do not argue that policy was wrong itself. But
I know.
When you have a medicine, a drug, you have this leaflet that say this and that may happen with a certain probability. And the second part was what I feel was not being done enough. And now I have the same feeling.
There will be inevitable losses, and the question is how do we best distribute them? If we now don't act to protect Europe, to raise our ability to defend ourselves even without the support of the Americans, then we risk imposing costs, for example, on frontline countries here in Eastern Europe. These countries need our help. If we don't support them, then they will bear the cost of future tensions with Russia. If we allow the US to exert trade pressure on Europe to bring down certain trade barriers, such as, a good example always the chlorinated chicken. That's something that most Europeans don't want from the Americans, but it's also a non-tariff trade barrier against US agricultural exports, and it's perfectly understandable that the Americans aren't happy with that. And that makes chicken more expensive in Europe, I guess. It is a cost, but it's something that people want. I think it's unfortunately inevitable that the best solution would be talk to each other to agree certain trade practices and certain regulations worldwide so that chlorinated chicken or some form of protection for chicken for food is accepted worldwide. And then the Americans produce chicken and we produce chicken and we can trade it with one another rather than us having one regulation and the Americans another would be great. But unfortunately, that's not where we're going. I'm not convinced that what we're going to do now is going to lead to higher inflation. I'm convinced it's going to lead to higher inflation in the long run, but I think in the short run, it will probably actually lead to lower inflation because what it's doing, we're talking about long-term investment, but in the short run, it's raising interest rates before the investment's even happening. And higher interest rates mean less activity, less employment, and therefore lower inflation and probably also lower interest rates in the short run.
Also in the short run, it seems that the first victim of this new trade-oriented policy is the climate policy. The US had forgone it completely. Europe is kind of watering it down, all the competitiveness compass. It begins with watering down certain regulations that people actually have been already preparing to enact. Isn't it actually counterproductive? Is there a better way to decouple from the Russian gas or the American gas than to use less gas because we'll be more energy efficient and we'll be more depending on renewables. Is there a better way to deal with the fact that we do not have raw materials than to build a circular economy and to use the materials that we already have?
That is also a question about distribution of losses, in this case, between current and future generations. So I think we were on track to take the needs of future generations, that future generations also want a world that is inhabitable, where food is plenty and so on. We were, with the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto process and so on, we were going there. Because of the stress that we've gone through worldwide over the last 5 years, the pandemic, the energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, now the trade wars, people are reducing how much they care for future generations and they care more for the current generations. And one of the outcomes is that people say, I want cheap energy now. Cheapest energy right now is still fossil energy. That's bad for the climate. It's cheap because we can impose the cost of using it onto future generations.
Also, it is in a lot of instances, for example, in Poland, it's imported energy in a very lot of cases. So being more autonomous is being more green because we use what we already have. This is the angle that I think is not represented right now. Because were we more advanced in the climate transition 5 years ago than when the Russian invasion on Ukraine started, we will say, okay, we will no longer buy your gas, and so what? We don't need it.
It's a little bit above my pay grade to comment exactly on the energy sector because there's so many technical things that you need to have a good grip on in order to determine what type of energy is cheaper. Of course, the marginal cost of production of wind or solar energy is very low, but we know in my country, in Germany, for example, how expensive it is to create the energy transport infrastructure to get the energy from where it's produced, which in Germany is mostly in the north, to where it's consumed, which in Germany is mostly in the south. Unfortunately, there's lots of periods where there's no wind and no sun, and so where renewable production goes down and where you need a replacement. In the extreme, you need to still be able to produce 100% of the energy at any moment in time with other energy. In the end, means that actually, potentially, that at least for the time being, the cost of renewables is still higher than the marginal cost. Wind is free, sun is free, would suggest. Now, this may be very different from country to country. As I said, for me, it's not a given that currently renewables is cheaper than non-renewable.
Energy efficiency is always cheaper than not efficiency, right? So the sort of investment that is both climate investment and security decoupling investment. To use less to make the same.
You're making an investment if you're becoming more energy efficient. At the end, do the same as you were doing before. Energy efficiency doesn't come cost-free. You have to invest to increase it.
Of course.
And that's an investment which does not create a new kind of supply. It just keeps supply where it is. And therefore, it's investment that, macroeconomic terms, creates demand right now, inflation right now, but doesn't create supply. Unlike if you build a new road or something like that, you create demand, but you also create supply. So in the short run, you create inflation, but in the long run, you create actually deflation. That's not the case with this kind of energy efficiency thing because you only create demand, but not supply. But that's probably also being a little bit simplistic because, as you correctly say, energy efficiency in the current global context reduces vulnerability, right? Increases resilience, and that is a value in itself, of course.
And you mentioned Germany, so maybe at the end of our discussion, let us take a closer look. Do you expect any major changes in economic and fiscal policy from the new coalition that is currently being formed? And if so, how will that affect the EU economy?
It's clear that the fiscal rule which Germany created for itself in 2011 after the global financial crisis, the famous debt brake, is unsustainable. It was clear already under the last government that, especially in the interpretation that Germany's constitutional court chose in 2023, 0.35% of GDP as a maximum borrowing allowance in structural terms, it's not enough to address the kind of structural changes that the economy is experiencing. And the structural changes include transition on the energy side, now the defense side. But even before that, right, when this rule was created in 2011, came after 10 years where Germany had zero net immigration. And in in the following 10 years, Germany had 6 million immigrants, people who didn't speak the language, didn't have the qualifications to immediately contribute to the economy. This is a massive structural change for which the constitutional debt brake wasn't created. Now, up until the pandemic, Germany was growing well. There was plenty of money available, so that the rule wasn't binding. Now, where the economy is weak, suddenly it had to change. So we expected already before the election that it would change, but we expected relatively moderate change. I think what we've learned since the election is that no longer is there just a need to change it, but there is now also potentially a leader, unlike previous German leaders, is much more of a risk taker. He's not as cautious as Olaf Scholz or Angela Merkel were over the last 20 years. He is somebody who's bolder, who's taking more risks. Now, whether the risks pay off, he's not even chancellor yet. We will see over the next few weeks. But yes, I would say that Germany's fiscal approach is changing. It is now about to use the fiscal space that it has relative to other large economies, right? Germany's debt ratio is just over 60%. It's almost 40 percentage points lower than the next G7 economy, which is probably the UK or Canada, I don't know. What we're also seeing is that markets are actually celebrating this. Yes, bond yields are up, but equity prices in Germany are up more. So markets are clearly telling us that this is something that we've been waiting for a long time, that suddenly Germany uses this fiscal space. And I think that is changing the debate in Germany. We've seen polls where a majority of people are supporting change to the constitutional debt brake. That wasn't the case over the last 10 years. There was always 2/3 support for the constitutional debt brake. Yes, there is a sea change, but there is still risk. The guy who's led us to this point, Friedrich Merz, is not the chancellor yet. He hasn't got the majorities yet. By the time this is emitted, maybe he has secured it. I hope he will, but there will be more stumbling blocks further down the line.
Uncertain times needs bold leaders, right?
Actually, I don't know if that's the case, but we will see. It looks like a change in leadership style in Germany after 20 years of cautious leadership, consensus-building leadership, but leadership, especially Angela Merkel, for instance, the Euro crisis. It looks like now we're going to see somebody who's going to be taking more risks. They are not a guaranteed positive outcome.
It's an exciting time to be an economist, right? Thank you very much, Christian.
Thank you, Hanna.
Thank you for listening. We teamed up with ECFI to try and make sense of the world and its challenges, to provide the actionable knowledge which helps better understand, decide, act. I hope these conversations were a step in that direction. See you next year at the Warsaw European Conversation.